Who are you? Not your name, not the roles you play in life, not the memories you cherish or the ambitions you chase. Who are you when the mirror reflects nothing but a fleeting collection of thoughts, feelings, and sensations? Close your eyes and imagine your mind as a river, ever flowing, never the same from one moment to the next. Each thought a ripple, each memory a passing reflection on the surface. And yet, somewhere beneath this torrent, we insist on a permanent self, a singular I that navigates our days with continuity and purpose. But what if that I is an illusion, a convenient story we tell ourselves to feel safe, anchored, and coherent in a chaotic world? This is not a hypothetical question. Philosophers have pondered it for millennia. In the East, Buddhism teaches anatta, the doctrine of no self, arguing that clinging to a permanent identity is the root of suffering. In the West, David Hume, the 18th century skeptic, suggested that what we call the self is nothing more than a bundle of perceptions, constantly shifting, never unified. We are not solid, permanent entities. We are patterns, fragments, processes masquerading as a singular being. And yet, we resist this truth with every fiber of our being. To live without a self is terrifying. To accept it is liberating. Consider a thought experiment. Imagine a perfect teleportation machine. It scans every atom of your body, every neural connection, every memory, and reconstructs you perfectly somewhere else. Is the person who steps out on the other side still you? If so, why? And if not, what exactly defines the you that experiences life? Or imagine your brain being gradually replaced, piece by piece, with synthetic parts. At what point, if any, do you cease to be yourself? Derek Parfit, the philosopher who dared to take these questions seriously, argued that our sense of identity is reducible to psychological continuity and connectedness. There is no singular soul, no unbroken thread of essence, only overlapping experiences, memories, and intentions that give the illusion of a self. But why does this matter? Because the idea of a permanent self shapes everything we do. Morality, responsibility, ambition, attachment. Each assumes there is a stable I that acts, suffers, and survives. If this I does not exist, then every action, every fear, every attachment becomes a story, a pattern, not a decree written in the stone of our being. Your life is not a fortress of individuality, but a fleeting constellation of experiences, each dissolving into the next. And this realization is profoundly unsettling. Yet there is beauty in this unsettling truth. Consider the relief that comes when you realize your failures, regrets, and insecurities are not immutable aspects of a self, but transient phenomena, waves in the stream of consciousness. The burdens of identity, the fear of judgment, the obsession with legacy, the tyranny of ego begin to lose their grip. The mind can breathe, unshackled from the chains of an imagined permanence. Parfit did not simply theorize about identity. He dismantled the very assumptions that give human life its familiar weight. By revealing the self as a series of interlocking patterns, he opened a doorway to understanding the fragility and freedom of existence. Imagine waking each day without the illusion of a singular self, seeing others not as extensions of your own ego, but as equally transient streams of experience, each as real and impermanent as your own. Such a vision is both disorienting and liberating, like standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind threatening to push you into the unknown, but the view revealing a horizon wider than you ever imagined. This is the terrain we are entering, a landscape where certainty dissolves, and the familiar boundaries of selfhood blur into shadow and light. The journey begins with a single, unsettling question. Who are you really? Look beyond your name, your memories, your fears. Look at the pattern beneath. What do you see? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. And in that tension, that space between certainty and uncertainty, we find the true essence of philosophical inquiry, the willingness to confront the illusion, to step into the unknown, and to see the world and ourselves without the comforting lie of permanence. The implications extend far beyond personal introspection. If the self is an illusion, then so too are many of the systems, hierarchies, and assumptions that govern human behavior. Justice, reward, punishment, love, hate. All these are built on the scaffolding of an assumed identity. To question the self is to question the foundations of morality, society, and the stories we tell ourselves about meaning. And this is precisely what Derek Parfit sought to illuminate: a radical reevaluation of existence, an invitation to confront the mind's most intimate illusions, and perhaps to glimpse the possibility of liberation. As the mirror reflects back at you, consider: the you looking into it is already different from the you a second ago, and will differ again a second later. Identity, permanence, selfhood, these are not truths, but narratives. And somewhere within this revelation lies a paradoxical freedom. The less we cling to the self, the more expansive our consciousness becomes, the more profound our engagement with reality can be. To live fully, we must first embrace the possibility that the self we inhabit is nothing more than a transient pattern, a flicker in the ever-moving river of existence. This is not just philosophy. It is an invitation, a challenge to reconsider what you are, how you live, and what you value. It is a confrontation with one of the deepest mysteries of human existence, the illusion that we are one, permanent, indivisible self. And as we venture further into the thought experiments, the history, and the radical ideas that Parfit so meticulously explored, prepare to question everything you believed about identity, responsibility, and the fragile architecture of consciousness itself. What is it that makes you you? Is it your memories, your thoughts, your body, or some indestructible soul that endures across time? For centuries, we have assumed identity is absolute, a single thread weaving our past, present, and future into a coherent whole. Derek Parfit shattered this assumption. He proposed that the self is not a monolithic entity but a pattern, a temporary arrangement of experiences, memories, and psychological connections. To understand this, imagine not a person, but a river. The river flows continuously, yet the water at one moment is never the same as the water the next. The river has identity only in the pattern of its flow. So too, Parfit argued, is personal identity a pattern of psychological continuity, not a static substance. Parfit's insights are radical precisely because they confront what humans most cling to: permanence. We are wired to see ourselves as continuous, unbroken beings, fearing death, fearing change, fearing loss. But psychological continuity, the link between our past, present, and anticipated future experiences, is what truly matters. If a future version of you shares the same memories, intentions, and personality traits, then, in a meaningful sense, it is still you, even if the physical body or the biological neurons have changed. Identity, therefore, becomes a matter of degree, not an absolute yes or no. Consider the ancient paradox of Theseus' ship. A ship has all its wooden planks gradually replaced over decades. Is it still the same ship? Most would say yes, because the structure and function remain continuous. The pattern persists. Parfit extended this thought experiment to humans. Imagine a cloning machine that replicates every molecule of your brain and body. A perfect copy emerges, your memories, habits, and consciousness intact. Is the clone you? Physically identical, psychologically indistinguishable, yet separated in space. Parfit would argue that identity is not binary. What matters is connectedness, continuity, and the overlapping patterns of psychological life. You do not have to be the same thing to retain moral and existential significance. This perspective destabilizes our conventional understanding of morality and responsibility. Legal systems, ethical theories, and social norms presume the existence of a stable, indivisible self. We punish, reward, and empathize as if the same entity endures unchanged. But if identity is a pattern, continuity becomes the ethical anchor. We are accountable not to some unchanging essence, but to the patterns of thought, intention, and behavior we create and maintain. Parfit's view does not excuse cruelty or diminish moral responsibility. Rather, it reframes it. To harm someone is to disrupt a continuity of experience, not to attack a permanent soul. Similarly, acts of kindness extend the pattern of positive psychological continuity into the future. Clinging to the notion of a singular self is not merely philosophical. It is deeply psychological. Our brains are narrative machines, constantly stitching together experiences into a coherent story. Evolution favors this illusion. Seeing oneself as continuous enhances survival. Memory guides action, Anticipation guides planning. Identity guides social bonds. Neuroscience confirms that the self is distributed across networks in the brain, emergent rather than fundamental. Yet our instinct to maintain the illusion is so strong that even the most logical arguments struggle to penetrate it. Cognitive biases, confirmation bias, the self-serving bias, the illusion of continuity, reinforce the story we tell ourselves. Parfit's brilliance lies in recognizing this human tendency while daring to confront it. The implications of seeing the self as a pattern extend beyond abstract thought experiments. Imagine approaching life with this understanding. Failure, loss, and suffering become transient phenomena, patterns that shift and dissipate rather than permanent marks upon an enduring self. Grief, anger, pride, and guilt all lose some of their tyranny when seen as temporary streams in the river of consciousness. Likewise, empathy deepens. If others are patterns, just like you, their experiences gain significance, not because they are other fixed selves, but because continuity of experience is precious wherever it arises. The boundaries between self and other blur, revealing the interdependence of conscious life. Parfit also challenged the fear of mortality. Death, under this framework, is less a catastrophic obliteration and more a natural reconfiguration of patterns. What matters is the persistence of connectedness, the impact you leave behind, the memories you instill in others, the continuity you foster in relationships, institutions, and culture. Life is no longer about defending an immutable ego, but cultivating enduring patterns that matter to future experiences. This radical shift transforms existence from a personal struggle for permanence into a conscious effort to shape the flow of experience, to weave patterns of meaning into a transient, impermanent world. Yet Parfit's ideas are not merely comforting or abstract. They are revolutionary. They demand that we reassess our concepts of self-interest, ambition, and legacy. If identity is reducible to patterns, then much of human anxiety, the need to achieve, to dominate, to preserve oneself, is based on an illusion. But rather than inducing nihilism, this perspective opens a path toward liberation. We are free to act with less attachment, to care more deeply without ego-driven constraints, to navigate life as a participant in an unfolding pattern, aware of impermanence, but not crippled by it. In practical terms, understanding the self as a pattern invites profound reflection on human behavior, society, and ethics. Systems of power, authority, and hierarchy rely on the illusion of fixed identities. Propaganda exploits ego-driven fears. Social media amplifies attachment to a coherent persona, and institutions presume continuity where none fundamentally exists. Parfit's philosophy allows us to see these patterns for what they are, to question the invisible scaffolding that shapes decisions and perception. In recognizing the self as a pattern, we gain not only intellectual clarity, but a lens for critiquing the structures that govern collective life. The radical nature of Parfit's insight is also profoundly personal. To accept that the self is a pattern is to confront vulnerability and impermanence directly. It requires courage to live fully, without clinging to an imagined essence. Yet it is precisely in this acceptance that a deeper freedom emerges, a freedom from fear, from ego, from attachment, and from the tyranny of an identity we never truly owned. We are, in the end, rivers flowing toward the ocean of experience, impermanent yet meaningful, transient yet significant. Parfit's vision does not dismantle life, it reframes it. To see the self as a pattern is to engage with existence in its raw, beautiful, fragile complexity. It asks us to live consciously, ethically, and imaginatively, aware that what matters is continuity of experience, not permanence of ego. It invites reflection on how we relate to others, to society, and to the fleeting patterns that constitute reality itself. In the dance of memory, thought, and perception, the self emerges and dissolves, yet significance persists. And in understanding this, we glimpse a freedom as profound as it is unsettling, a freedom to live, love, and act without the illusion of a permanent I, yet with the clarity that patterns endure. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the you've clung to for decades, the central character in your life story, is nothing but a pattern. Not a fixed, unchanging essence, but a fluid arrangement of memories, habits, and psychological connections that constantly shift. At first, this realization is disorienting, even terrifying. Humans are hardwired to protect the illusion of self. From the cradle to the grave, we define our worth, our morality, and our social identity through the lens of an assumed permanence. To discover that the self is an illusion is to confront not only personal vulnerability, but the very foundation of human civilization. Ego, in this sense, is society's anchor. It drives ambition, fuels desire, and shapes relationships. It is the engine behind competition, conformity, and hierarchy. We cling to the self because it provides a narrative of coherence, a story we can rely on to navigate the chaotic currents of existence. But what happens when that story unravels? Morality, for instance, is intricately linked to the perception of enduring selfhood. We punish wrongdoers because we believe a permanent I has been harmed. We reward virtue because we assume the self will benefit in the long term. If identity is merely a series of transient patterns, then ethics becomes less about protecting a fixed entity and more about preserving continuity of experience, intention, and consequence. The implications ripple far beyond morality. Relationships, built on attachment, loyalty, and love, assume stable selves at either end. Friendship, partnership, and family rely on predictable continuity, the promise that the person you know today will be recognizable tomorrow. If selfhood is fluid, attachment transforms. Grudges, jealousy, and resentment lose their grip. Empathy expands as the barriers between self and other dissolve into a shared pattern of consciousness. One can care deeply without being bound by ego-driven possessiveness. One can act altruistically without the constant calculation of self-interest. History offers profound examples of how rigid belief in a permanent self shapes societal structures. Feudal hierarchies, monarchies, and social classes depended on a clear notion of fixed identity, divinely ordained roles, immutable status, and lineage. Even modern institutions, justice systems, economic markets, political campaigns, operate on the assumption that individuals are continuous, accountable entities. Social media has taken this further, forcing everyone into carefully curated, seemingly permanent personas. The illusion of self is exploited at scale. Data, influence, and power are wielded against patterns of identity that we mistake for unchangeable truths. Parfit's perspective exposes these assumptions, revealing how fragile the scaffolding of society truly is. Psychology reinforces the stubbornness of the ego. Cognitive biases, memory distortions, and narrative fallacies all serve to protect the self-concept. We rewrite history, exaggerate achievements, suppress failures, and selectively remember events to preserve the coherence of identity. This is not deception in the traditional sense. It is survival. A stable sense of self allows us to plan, form attachments, and anticipate consequences. Yet it is precisely this constructed continuity that Parfit challenges. By understanding the mind as a dynamic network of shifting patterns, we see that suffering, shame, and anxiety are not permanent stains on an eternal self. They are transient states, passing waves in a river of consciousness. Letting go of ego has profound practical consequences. Decision-making shifts from self-preservation toward pattern preservation. Choices are no longer dominated by fear of loss or attachment to an imagined identity. They are guided by understanding, foresight, and ethical continuity. Consider how this might play out in daily life. An executive no longer acts purely to safeguard career status, but seeks the long-term continuity of the organization and its impact. A parent no longer clings possessively to a child's achievements, but fosters experiences that preserve growth and psychological continuity. Conflict resolution becomes less about defending a fragile ego and more about sustaining patterns of shared well-being. The liberation of living without a self also extends to emotional resilience. Loss, grief, failure, and change no longer annihilate a supposed permanent self. They simply alter transient patterns. The illusion of permanence is replaced by acceptance of flux. Anxiety about legacy diminishes because what endures is not the I, but the continuity of influence, memory, and connectedness. Empathy flourishes as the boundaries between self and other soften. Social cohesion, paradoxically, strengthens when we recognize that rigid identities are artificial constructs. Cultural and philosophical history is replete with examples that echo Parfit's insights. Stoic philosophers taught detachment from ego, urging focus on what is within our control while accepting impermanence. Buddhist traditions emphasize non-attachment to self and ego as a path to liberation. Modern psychology corroborates these teachings. Mindfulness, cognitive restructuring, and perspective-taking all diminish rigid self-identification, reducing suffering and enhancing well-being. Parfit's radical philosophy synthesizes these strands, grounding them in rigorous analytical reasoning while preserving their ethical and practical significance. Accepting the self as an illusion does not lead to nihilism. On the contrary, it invites a profound engagement with reality. Life becomes less about defending an imaginary fortress of identity and more about shaping meaningful patterns of thought, action, and relationship. Human creativity, morality, and compassion gain depth when freed from egoistic constraints. We begin to navigate life as participants in a dynamic system, aware that permanence is a myth, yet significance emerges from the patterns we cultivate. Consider modern social pressures. Individuals are constantly evaluated, ranked, and surveilled through metrics, likes, and influence scores. These systems thrive because we believe in fixed selves, measurable and comparable. The liberation of seeing selfhood as a pattern undermines these pressures. Identity becomes flexible, adaptable, and resistant to manipulation. Actions gain intrinsic ethical value rather than being measured solely by egoistic advantage. Social structures, then, can be critiqued and reshaped with clarity, because we recognize their foundation as a projection of assumed permanence rather than unassailable truth. Ultimately, living without a self is both challenging and freeing. It demands courage to relinquish deeply held assumptions and confront uncertainty. Yet it opens the possibility of a life less burdened by fear, envy, and attachment. Individuals begin to act ethically out of recognition of connectedness rather than coercion or social pressure. Relationships deepen, empathy expands, and society benefits from more flexible, responsive patterns of interaction. Mortality ceases to terrify, because existence is understood as a series of transient but meaningful patterns. In embracing impermanence, we find clarity, compassion, and freedom. The radical insight Parfit offers is simple yet transformative. The self is not a fixed entity. It is a collection of interconnected, ephemeral patterns. Accepting this reshapes psychology, ethics, and society itself. It reveals that much of human suffering, conflict, and anxiety arises not from the external world, but from clinging to an illusory self. By living without ego, we see reality more clearly, act more wisely, and engage more compassionately. We participate fully in the river of consciousness, aware of its impermanence, yet fully present in its flow. We began with a question: who are you really? The answer, it seems, is far more unsettling and far more liberating than most of us could ever imagine. The self, as we have come to know it, is not a monolithic, permanent entity. It is a pattern, a narrative woven from memories, thoughts, intentions, and fleeting experiences. To accept this is to step into a world where identity is fluid, where permanence is an illusion, and where freedom lies not in clinging to an imagined I, but in embracing impermanence. This realization reframes the entire human experience. Every choice, every fear, every attachment is no longer a defense of a static self, but an engagement with the patterns that flow through life. Consider morality. If the self is transient, ethics ceases to revolve around protecting an immutable ego and instead focuses on sustaining continuity, reducing suffering, and fostering meaningful connections across the shifting landscape of human experience. Compassion gains a new depth when we see others not as permanent, rival selves, but as equally transient patterns, each as real and impermanent as our own. Empathy becomes less a strategic calculation and more a natural recognition of shared existence. History offers countless examples of societies clinging to the illusion of permanent identity, and the consequences are profound. Hierarchies, monarchies, and rigid social structures thrived on the belief that some selves were fixed, destined, and immutable. In the modern age, the illusion of identity manifests in social media, surveillance, and reputation-driven culture. where curated personas are mistaken for unchanging truths. Understanding the self as a pattern undermines these illusions. It exposes the fragility of systems built on ego, status, and permanence, inviting reflection on how we might reconstruct society with more flexibility, resilience, and ethical coherence. On a personal level, liberation comes from surrendering attachment to the I we mistakenly believe we inhabit. Life's failures, losses, and disappointments are no longer assaults on an eternal self, but shifts in a transient pattern. Joy, love, and achievement are no longer possessions of a fixed ego, but experiences to be fully lived and appreciated, impermanent yet meaningful. The anxiety of legacy diminishes because significance resides not in maintaining an eternal identity, but in fostering enduring patterns that touch others, inspire change, and propagate connectedness. The philosophy of impermanence does not erase meaning, it deepens it. To live without a rigid self is to act with intention, clarity, and presence. Every action becomes more deliberate, every choice more ethical, because we recognize that what endures is not the ego, but the continuity of experience and the influence we leave on patterns beyond ourselves. In relationships, this insight fosters empathy and compassion as the boundaries between self and other blur. In society, it cultivates responsibility and ethical engagement, as the recognition of shared impermanence demands care for the patterns we help sustain. Psychologically, the insight aligns with mindfulness and contemplative traditions. Stoics taught detachment from ego as a path to serenity. Buddhists emphasized non-self and impermanence as a route to liberation from suffering. Modern cognitive science corroborates these ideas. Attachment to a fixed identity generates anxiety, resentment, and fear, while flexible self-concepts promote resilience, perspective-taking, and well-being. Parfit bridges philosophy and psychology, showing that accepting the self as a pattern is not an abstract exercise, but a transformative approach to life, thought, and action. Consider mortality. Death, under the illusion of a permanent self, is a catastrophe. It annihilates the I we mistakenly believe persists forever. But as a pattern, the self is always in flux. Death is a natural continuation of impermanence. What matters is the continuity of influence, memory, and relational patterns. Life gains poignancy not from clinging to permanence, but from shaping patterns that endure ethically and emotionally. The river of consciousness continues, and our engagement with it, our thoughts, choices, and care for others, creates ripples that extend beyond the illusion of a singular self. In practical terms, living with this understanding changes the way we approach power, ambition, and society. We no longer act purely to defend or aggrandize a rigid ego. Leadership becomes stewardship, relationships become collaboration, and morality becomes an active shaping of patterns that matter to others. The fear that drives conflict, fear of loss, fear of irrelevance, fear of annihilation diminishes. Decision-making becomes less reactive and more reflective, guided by the long-term consequences for the continuity of experience, rather than the fleeting satisfaction of ego. Parfit's insights also challenge cultural obsession with reputation, social validation, and individual immortality. In a world obsessed with self-image and curated identity, understanding the self as a pattern provides profound clarity. Social pressures, competition, and comparison lose their grip. What persists is not the perfection of image or the accumulation of accolades, but the ethical and psychological continuity of the patterns we create. Life becomes less about defending an illusion and more about cultivating meaning, impact, and connection in the present moment. Yet this freedom comes with responsibility. To recognize the self as an illusion is not to abdicate action or to dismiss ethics. It is to act with awareness, to care for patterns of experience, and to engage with the world as a participant in an interconnected network of impermanent, yet meaningful consciousness. By doing so, we elevate our moral and emotional life beyond the constraints of ego, attachment, and fear. The self dissolves, but significance remains. Ultimately, Parfit offers a vision of liberation. The self is a fluid narrative, a sequence of interlocking patterns, and our engagement with it determines the quality of life, morality, and society. By embracing impermanence, we gain freedom. Freedom from fear, from attachment, from judgment, and from the tyranny of ego. We learn to act ethically without coercion, to empathize without calculation, and to live fully in the river of consciousness, aware of its transient beauty. We return, finally, to the question with which we began. Who are you, really? You are not the unchanging observer you imagined. You are a pattern of thought, memory, and experience, flowing through time. You are impermanent yet significant, transient yet capable of shaping enduring effects in the world. And in this realization lies a paradoxical freedom. The less you cling to the self, the more fully you can engage with life, others, and reality itself. Understanding the self as an illusion is not nihilism. It is a gateway to empathy, ethical responsibility, and liberation. It invites us to confront mortality without terror, to act without egoistic constraints, and to see the interdependence of all patterns in consciousness. Life, when viewed through this lens, is a canvas of impermanent yet meaningful experiences, and we are both participants and creators of the patterns that endure. To embrace the self as a pattern is to step into a profound freedom, a freedom to think, feel, and act beyond the illusions that constrain most human lives. It is to recognize that identity, morality, and meaning are woven from transient threads, yet the tapestry they create is real, beautiful, and significant. In surrendering the illusion of permanence, we find clarity, courage, and the possibility of a life fully and deeply lived.